Hey there, I'm Marv, and tonight I'm going to tell you the entire story of Julius Caesar. It begins in the cramped, noisy streets of Republican Rome and wends its way through battlefields in Gaul, storm-tossed seas full of pirates, glittering palaces on the Nile, and finally into a Senate house on a March morning that would change the ancient world forever. It is a story of ambition and loyalty, of friends who became rivals, of a man who reshaped a republic and then paid the price for it. Along the way, we will meet generals and orators, queens and conspirators, and see how one life ended up giving its name to emperors for centuries to come. As always, I would really love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these history videos, please consider liking and subscribing. It is the simplest way to support the channel, and it truly helps me keep bringing you more stories like this. Thank you for being here. And now, let's begin. Rome at the start of the 1st century, before the Common Era, was a city that liked to think of itself as the center of the world, although it still looked rather improvised in places. Streets twisted and climbed over the hills in ways that made little sense to anyone except the people who had always lived there. The Forum could be grand when the light caught the columns and statues just so, but step a little away from the main square and things became crowded, noisy, and a bit shabby. Behind many of the impressive names and titles, families were quietly worrying about debts, rivals, and the next election. It was into this busy and anxious city that a child named Gaius Julius Caesar was born, sometime in the high summer of the year 100 before the Common Era. The family Caesar was born into, the Julii, were old Romans, which counted for a great deal in a society that venerated its past with almost religious intensity. The Julii belonged to the patrician class, those original families that tradition said had stood beside the first kings and then created the republic. They also cherished a particularly glittering claim. Their ancestors, so they said, included the Trojan hero Aeneas, and through him the goddess Venus. This was the sort of ancestral story that sounds suspiciously convenient, but in Rome it carried real weight. To say that Caesar grew up in a house where the family line led back to a goddess is not much of an exaggeration. Yet for all that grand ancestry, the Julii were not at the top of the political heap. They had drifted a little from the center of power. There were richer families, families with more recent consuls, families with larger estates and longer lists of clients. Caesar's father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, had achieved the office of praetor, an important position that involved presiding over courts and sometimes governing a province. It meant the family was respectable and firmly embedded in the senatorial class, but not one of the handful of clans who could assume that the highest offices would fall into their laps as a matter of course. Caesar's mother Aurelia came from the Aurelii Cottae, another well-regarded family. Ancient writers speak of her with unusual warmth. She appears as intelligent, strict in the Roman way, and very capable. In a culture where mothers arranged marriages, managed households, and often guided the early steps of political careers from behind the scenes, having someone like Aurelia at the center of the home was a great advantage. One can imagine the young Caesar learning early that it was possible to be both formidable and composed, and that real authority often spoke quietly. The wider family included a figure who loomed unusually large over the boy's early years. Caesar's aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, one of the most successful generals of his age. Marius had broken into the highest offices without the benefit of ancient patrician ancestry, relying instead on military victories and popular support. He reformed the Roman army, opening it to poorer citizens, and won famous campaigns against foreign enemies. In the house where Caesar grew up, the name of Marius was not just a name from public life. It was family. Stories about his victories and reforms were stories about an uncle. For a young boy listening at the edge of adult conversation, it must have been hard not to draw the conclusion that exceptional talent and determination could push a man beyond the place his birth had allotted to him. However inspiring Marius may have looked from inside the household, his career stirred up powerful opposition. Roman politics in Caesar's youth was becoming increasingly polarized. On one side were the Optimates, senators who wanted power to remain in the hands of a narrow elite. On the other were the Populares, politicians who appealed more directly to the assemblies of ordinary citizens. Marius and his allies, including men like Lucius Cornelius Cinna, were associated with the popular cause. Their opponents gathered behind another Lucius Cornelius, Sulla, a patrician general with a very different view of how the republic should be run. For a sensitive youngster, simply watching who came to dinner, who stopped calling, and who disappeared from view would have been an education in how fragile public standing could be. Caesar's father took up a provincial command in Asia on the eastern shores of the Aegean. The family spent time there, and the young Caesar had his first close encounter with the Greek world. Towns in Asia Minor were older than Rome, full of temples, theatres, and colonnaded squares. The language in the streets, the styles of dress, the rhythms of daily life, all would have seemed cosmopolitan compared to the rougher energy of Rome. It was an early reminder that Rome, confident as it was, stood within a much wider web of cultures and histories. For a boy who would one day think in terms of continents rather than hills, that experience mattered. When Caesar was still in his teens, his father died suddenly, reportedly while putting on his shoes one morning. With that small domestic moment, the young man became, in legal terms, the head of his household. In practice, it meant that Aurelia would now play an even larger role in running family affairs, while Caesar began to shoulder more responsibility and to think about how to turn the family name into something that matched its legendary origins. Roman boys of his class were educated in rhetoric, law, and history. Tutors drilled them in the art of speaking persuasively in public, in the stories of the early republic, and in the precedents that held the legal system together. Caesar proved gifted at this sort of thing. He absorbed history and language with ease and developed an early taste for the well-crafted sentence that could cut or soothe as needed. Meanwhile, the political storms in Rome intensified. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla turned into open conflict, complete with armies marching on Rome itself. That possibility had once been unthinkable. Roman soldiers were supposed to defend the Republic from foreign enemies, not bring war into the streets of their own city. Yet, that is exactly what happened more than once while Caesar was growing up. The city became a battleground of factions. Victories on the field were followed by purges at home, and lists of enemies were posted for elimination. Caesar's own position in this chaos was shaped by family loyalties. Through his aunt Julia and his mother's sympathies, he was associated with Marius and Cinna rather than with Sulla. In his later teens, he married Cornelia, Cinna's daughter, a match that confirmed this alignment. The union was a sensible political partnership and seems to have been a close personal bond as well. To the young couple, it likely looked like a step into a future in which their side would share in power. To Sulla, when he emerged as the dominant figure after seizing control, it looked like dangerous defiance. Once Sulla had the city, he embarked on a brutal tidying up of his enemies. The prescriptions that followed were chillingly simple. Lists of names were posted, and anyone whose name appeared could be killed with legal impunity, their property confiscated by the state. Friends and relatives who tried to protect them were also at risk. In that climate of fear, Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. Obeying would have been the safe course. Many others accepted similar orders and separated from spouses and allies to save themselves. Caesar refused. It is one of those moments that reveals something about a character that later events only confirm. He chose loyalty to his wife and his connections over obedience to the man who currently held almost absolute power. Sulla responded by stripping him of his priesthood and property, and adding his name to the list of those to be hunted. Caesar left the city, keeping ahead of the men sent to arrest him, helped along by friends of his family who were willing to risk their own standing to intercede. Some sources report that Sulla eventually allowed Caesar to go into a safer kind of exile, grumbling that in this young man there were many Mariuses. The line may have been polished in hindsight, but the idea that Sulla sensed something troublesome and exceptional in Caesar rings true. With Rome a dangerous place, Caesar looked to the one arena where a man of noble birth could still build a career without immediately antagonizing the ruling faction. He went to serve in the army in Asia Minor. Military service suited him. He had physical courage and a clear head in danger, and he had already learned from watching Marius what a successful general could become in Roman society. In the campaign that included the siege of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, Caesar distinguished himself enough to receive the Corona Civica. The civic crown was not a trinket. It was woven from oak leaves and was awarded for saving the life of a fellow citizen in battle. The recipient had the right to wear it at public events, and every Roman who saw it was reminded that this was a man who had risked his life for others. For an ambitious young aristocrat, it was both a sign of valor and a useful piece of stage dressing. Caesar wore it in later years as part of a carefully crafted public image, but at the time it was also simply proof that he had faced real danger and not flinched. During his Eastern service, Caesar spent time at the court of King Nicomedes of Bithynia. Courts in the Greek East worked by different rules than the Roman Senate. They revolved around monarchy, pageantry, and the intimate circle of advisors around a king. Caesar watched how flattery, gifts, and ritual were used to cement loyalty. He provided assistance to Nicomedes on Roman business and sought favor in return. Later, Roman gossip turned this period into material for crude jokes, suggesting that Caesar had yielded too much to his royal host. The jokes may tell us more about the cruelty of political humor in Rome than about what actually happened, but they also hint at how carefully Romans monitored one another for any sign of softness or deviation from their own stern ideals. As time passed, Sulla retired from public life and then died. His arrangements for the Republic, designed to lock power securely in the hands of the Senate, could not completely suppress the tensions that had produced conflict in the first place, but they did ease the immediate climate of terror. Men who had fled returned cautiously to the city. Caesar was among them. He had proven himself as a soldier. He had survived proscription, and he was ready to begin the more delicate work of turning that experience into political capital. One of the main training grounds for such ambitions was the law court. Roman citizens flocked to trials, not only to see justice done, but also to watch skilled advocates perform. Caesar began to appear there as a prosecutor, taking on men accused of extortion in the provinces. This was not entirely altruistic. Corrupt governors were tempting targets, since they were resented by the communities they had plundered, and sometimes by rival senators at home. By attacking them, Caesar could pose as a champion of justice and at the same time show that he was not afraid to challenge powerful figures. His style as an orator was described as energetic and controlled, with a clear and elegant Latin that impressed listeners even when they disagreed with his arguments. He was not yet the most celebrated speaker in Rome. That title belonged to men like Cicero, but he was already making people take notice. In a city where careers were built and destroyed in front of crowds, being memorable was essential. Caesar also showed a flair for generosity. He supported lavish prosecutions, entertained allies, and quietly shouldered expenses that outstripped his income. In a culture where giving gifts and hosting events were central to politics, this generosity was both admired and worrying. It meant that by the time he reached his late 20s, he was already running up debts. Caesar understood that if he wanted to compete with the finest speakers and persuade voters in the noisy assemblies, he had to sharpen his skills even further. For that, many ambitious Romans went to the Greek world, where rhetoric had been studied for centuries as a serious art. Caesar planned to travel to Rhodes, an island famous for its schools of oratory, to study with Apollonius Molon, a respected teacher who had also instructed Cicero. It was a sensible next step. He had family name, military honor, a reputation beginning to grow in the courts, and a determination to make his voice carry farther and more effectively. So he prepared to leave Italy once more. The route would take him across waters that were busy not only with traders and official ships, but also with men whom Rome regarded as the enemies of all civilized people, bands who made a living by seizing anything that floated past and holding passengers for ransom. Caesar knew about them, of course. Every educated Roman knew that the Eastern Mediterranean was infested with pirates who had grown bold as Rome concentrated on its wars elsewhere. What he did not yet know was that these pirates were about to step directly into his story, and that he would come away from that encounter with one of the most striking episodes in a life that was already beginning to collect remarkable scenes. The journey that was supposed to be a simple sea crossing began well enough. Caesar left the Italian mainland with the brisk confidence of a man who had clear plans. The Mediterranean at this time of year could be pleasant rather than dangerous, and he had every reason to think of the voyage as a brief interval between stages of his own improvement. He wanted to refine his skills in speaking and argument, and the famed teachers on the island of Rhodes were the next step on that ladder. He had with him a modest retinue, some baggage, and the easy assumption that the world would more or less behave itself. Out on the water, however, other people were making a living in a very different way. The Eastern Mediterranean in the 70s, before the Common Era, was thick with pirates. The word can conjure up images of theatrical villains with parrots and eye patches, but the men who haunted those coasts were a more practical and unpleasant breed. They were often Cilicians, from the rugged shores of southern Anatolia, or a mixture of seafarers who had discovered that raiding was more profitable than fishing. They attacked grain ships, coastal villages, and rich travelers. Rome regarded them as pests, and occasionally as a serious threat, especially when they disrupted the grain supply, but the Republican government had been busy with civil wars and rival generals. A great deal of loud concern had been expressed in the Senate, and much less had actually been done. The pirate trade flourished in the gap between Roman words and Roman action. Somewhere near the coasts that faced the island known as Pharmacusa, Caesar's ship sailed into the path of such a group. The exact details are lost, but the essentials are clear enough. Fast pirate vessels, with experienced crews, closed in on the slower merchant ship that carried Caesar and his companions. Armed men clambered aboard, and the usual short and ugly business followed. The crew and passengers were subdued. Those who looked valuable, or who were clearly attached to someone valuable, were kept. Others might be killed or left behind. That morning, Caesar discovered that he had joined the category of marketable property. Ransom was the core of this business. The pirates did not want to keep prisoners forever. The whole point was to identify people whose families or patrons could be persuaded to pay large sums for their safe return. When they understood that they had a young Roman aristocrat in their hands, the pirates began the standard routine. They suggested a ransom of 20 talents of silver. For most people, this would have been an astonishingly high figure. A talent was a weight of valuable metal, not a coin, and 20 of them represented a fortune that could ruin a small town. Caesar laughed at them. According to the ancient accounts, he was insulted by the figure. Did they not know who they had captured? He insisted that they raise the ransom to 50 talents. It is an extraordinary moment. The captive effectively negotiated a higher price on his own head. Behind the bravado, there was calculation. A man valued at 50 talents was a serious person. A man valued at 20 was simply expensive. Caesar was also confident that he could find people in the nearby cities who would produce such a sum. His friends and clients in the region, together with his own credit as an ambitious nobleman, would cover the cost. The pirates agreed. They were hardly going to argue against more silver. Caesar sent some of his companions ashore to visit the city of Miletus and other friendly communities and to gather the money. That left him on the island in the company of about 37 seasoned criminals. For most prisoners, this would have been the beginning of a miserable stretch of fear and boredom. For Caesar, it became something very different. He treated the pirate camp as though it were a slightly uncouth country villa where he had chosen to spend some time. He moved about freely, ate at the same tables, and joined in their games and exercises. He did not slump or cower. He behaved as if he were the one who had invited them. When he wanted to sleep, he told them to be quiet. When they were noisy late into the night, he scolded them. The odd thing is that they listened. The force of his personality, and perhaps the novelty of having such a guest, took much of the menace out of their relationship. Caesar also did something very Roman and very characteristic. He used the time as an audience for his words. He wrote poems and speeches and then read them out loud to the pirates. They were, as you might imagine, not the most appreciative literary critics. When they failed to applaud or looked bored, Caesar called them ignorant and uncultured. This amused them more than it offended them. It was like having a particularly haughty guest at dinner who insisted on delivering after-meal lectures. The situation should have made him feel utterly powerless. Instead, he found a way to treat it as an odd sort of holiday. There was one part of his banter that the pirates did not take seriously enough. He told them repeatedly that when he was free, he would come back and catch them. He explained with great calm that he would have them crucified. The pirates laughed each time he said it. Romans regarded crucifixion as the ultimate public punishment for slaves and criminals, and the idea that a current captive would prescribe this fate for his captors sounded like a joke in very poor taste. Caesar, however, spoke in the manner of a man who was making a promise rather than a jest. The days stretched on. Ancient sources give a figure of about 38 days in captivity. In that time he played at board games, composed, read, and apparently joined in physical drills. He kept up the conversation about his plans and his intention to take revenge. He observed the habits of these men at close range. He saw how they organized their guard shifts, where they kept their ships, how they divided loot. For someone with a trained eye for advantage, this was not wasted observation. Meanwhile, his companions were scurrying along the coast, pressing friends and allies for funds. 50 talents did not materialize easily. Cities like Miletus had their own needs and their own resentments about pirate raids. At the same time, they understood that helping a rising Roman noble could bring rewards later. Caesar's own credit was another source. Romans of his class often lived ahead of their means, borrowing against future success. The ransom for his own head would eventually become one more addition to a growing pile of obligations. At last the money was gathered. Ships arrived at the pirate base, heavy with sacks of silver. The bandits counted and weighed their treasure with pleased concentration. Caesar was released. There were probably handshakes of a sort, perhaps a last amused argument or two. One imagines laughter, a few rude jokes at the expense of the proud Roman who had spent more than a month as their guest. Then the ships parted and headed their separate ways. The pirates had their 50 talents. Caesar had his freedom. What the pirates did not entirely appreciate was that they had also equipped him with knowledge and fiery motivation. Once he was back among friendly communities, Caesar did not simply sink into a warm bath and make for Rhodes. He went to the authorities in the region, particularly the officials in the Roman province of Asia, and demanded ships and men. He argued that it was an embarrassment for Rome that these pirates operated so freely, and that an opportunity had presented itself to strike them while they were relaxed and scattered. It helped that the coastal cities were eager to see the pirates punished and their hoards confiscated. With a small flotilla hastily assembled from local vessels and crews, Caesar moved back toward the island where he had been kept. He knew the routes, the anchorages, and the daily routine of his former captors. He sailed with purpose and speed. When his ships appeared, the pirates were caught off guard. There were no carefully built fortifications on the island, only temporary shelters and moored vessels. The pirates scrambled to respond. But this time, the balance of surprise and force was on Caesar's side. His men boarded their ships, captured their crews, and rounded up those who tried to flee inland. The treasure that had so delighted the pirates a short time before now changed hands again. Caesar recovered the ransom that had been paid for his own release, along with other loot taken from earlier victims. The captured pirates were taken to the city of Pergamon and locked up while Caesar considered the appropriate next step. In Roman practice, captured pirates could be sold into slavery or executed. Crucifixion was a frequent choice for those regarded as enemies of the peace and order of the Mediterranean. Caesar approached the local governor, a man named Junius, and urged him to carry out the executions. The governor hesitated. He was perhaps concerned about legal niceties, or possibly about the prospect of killing a large group of men without a clear directive from higher authorities. Whatever his reasons, he dragged his feet. Caesar, who had not forgotten his very explicit promises, grew impatient. In the end, he took matters into his own hands. He ordered that the pirates be brought out and crucified along the coast. The line between justice and vengeance blurred here in a way that was very Roman. These men had robbed, abducted, terrorized, and disrupted trade. They were exactly the sort of outlaws for whom the most severe exemplary punishment was reserved. At the same time, Caesar was settling a personal score. He did make one concession to a gentler instinct. Before the crosses were raised, he had their throats cut, sparing them the full lingering agony that crucifixion was designed to inflict. It was a small mercy, but a real one. In that grim row of bodies we see a complex figure. The young aristocrat who had laughed in their faces and read them his poems was not simply playing a charming game. He had meant every word of his threat. When circumstances allowed, he acted with speed and relentless determination. He could show courtesy and even generosity, but if he believed punishment was deserved, he did not hesitate to make it both certain and spectacular. News of all this spread quickly through the coastal communities and back toward Rome. Tales of the captured pirates and the young Roman who had turned the tables on them were the sort of story that merchants and sailors enjoyed telling. In Rome itself, senators and equestrians heard that Gaius Julius Caesar had not only survived capture, but had organized a private naval campaign and delivered justice in a way that the official authorities had repeatedly failed to do. It was the kind of exploit that began to set him apart from a crowd of other ambitious men. The episode had other practical outcomes. By recovering the ransom money and other treasure, Caesar eased some of the financial strain that his debts and ambitions had already begun to produce. He was still far from wealthy on the scale of the great magnates, but he had shown that he knew how to turn a disaster into an opportunity. It was also a vivid lesson in the limits of Roman power as it was currently organized. The fact that a private individual could gather ships, hunt down pirates, and deal with them, while governors hesitated and the Senate equivocated, underlined the gap between Roman claims and Roman performance. When Caesar at last continued his journey to Rhodes, he arrived not as a shaken survivor of an ordeal, but as someone who had added a dramatic chapter to his own story. He settled into the rhythm of study under Apollonius Molon, listening to lectures about structure, rhythm, and persuasive argument. Day after day he practiced the art of speaking with clarity and force, shaping his voice into an even sharper instrument. In the evenings he must have found time to retell his adventure at sea to fellow students and curious locals, perhaps with a dry smile at the memory of pirates who had been bored by his verses. The island of Rhodes offered him what he wanted, which was a place to refine the skills that would allow him to stand before the people of Rome and bend their attention in the direction he chose. Behind his learning, however, lay the knowledge that he had already faced danger with a sort of amused daring, and had answered it with calculated violence. Those who met him in those classrooms and courtyards were in the presence of a man who had learned early that the world rarely behaves, and that when it does not, a person with courage, quick thinking, and a streak of ruthlessness can sometimes shape events rather than simply endure them. In time, the call of Rome and of public life grew too strong to ignore. The city where elections were held, laws debated, and reputations made waited for him. Somewhere behind the noise of the assemblies, and the marble of the temples, there was space for a man who could command both soldiers and sentences. Caesar turned his gaze back toward Italy and began to plan his return. When Caesar returned from his time of study in the Greek world, he did not come back as a restless youngster drifting between possibilities. He came back with a clear sense of his own talents and a sharpened set of tools. He had seen how arguments could be constructed and dismantled, how a simple turn of phrase could provoke laughter or indignation, and how a speaker could move a crowd from suspicion to enthusiasm in a few careful steps. Rome was the stage on which these skills mattered most, and it was waiting for him with its usual mixture of opportunity and danger. The Republic at this point was in an uneasy mood. The reforms left in place by Sulla had strengthened the formal powers of the Senate, but the unrest that had produced civil war had not disappeared. Italians outside the city still felt their grievances. The urban poor still resented their dependence on the generosity of great patrons. Ambitious aristocrats still looked for ways to step around the limits that tradition placed in their path. Caesar, with his family connections and his own experience of the rougher edges of politics, understood this landscape more clearly than most. His first steps back in public life were modest in outward appearance. He held junior positions that allowed him to learn the internal workings of the state and to be seen by those who mattered. One of his earliest important offices was as a military tribune. This was a role attached to the legions rather than to the Senate, and it gave him experience in managing soldiers and dealing with the small but constant decisions that come with command. For someone whose future would be so closely tied to the loyalty of troops, it was a useful apprenticeship. At the same time, he began to associate himself more openly with politicians who wanted to undo some of the restrictions that Sulla had placed on the popular assemblies and their tribunes. Supporting the restoration of powers to those tribunes was a way of presenting himself as a friend of the common citizens, without openly challenging the entire Sullan settlement. It was a careful step, not a reckless leap, the move of a man who understood that long-term success in Rome required both bold gestures and a sense of timing. In the year 69, before the Common Era, Caesar was elected quaestor. The quaestorship was the first of the traditional steps on the ladder of public office. It involved financial responsibilities, often in the provinces, and automatically gave him a seat in the Senate. Caesar was assigned to serve in Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula that Rome had been slowly absorbing over nearly 2 centuries. Spain was a long way from Rome, both in distance and in atmosphere. The land varied from fertile river valleys to rugged highlands, and Roman control was a patchwork of colonies, allied cities, and regions that were only nominally under the Republic's authority. As quaestor, Caesar dealt with accounts, supplies, and the endless complications of provincial administration. It was not glamorous work, but it taught him how the empire functioned outside the capital, and how decisions made in the Curia affected real communities at the edges of Roman power. There is a famous story from this period that says more about his inner life than a stack of official reports ever could. At the southern tip of the peninsula, near the town of Gades, there stood a temple of Hercules with old statues and dedications. Among them, according to later writers, was an image of Alexander of Macedon. Caesar, visiting the sanctuary, paused before the statue and contemplated the fact that at about the same age, Alexander had marched through Asia, conquering kingdoms, while he was still only a provincial quaestor balancing ledgers and writing letters, The story has him bursting into tears and confiding to a companion that he was deeply dissatisfied with how little he had achieved. Even if the incident was embellished in the telling, it captures something important. Caesar did not measure his progress against the careers of ordinary senators. He measured it against the most dazzling conquerors of the past. Where others might have been content to say that they were on track and doing rather well, he looked at his position and saw only delay. This hunger did not make him careless in his duties. The quaestorship passed without scandal, and he returned to Rome with the necessary experience and the formal entry into the Senate, but also with a restless determination that would shape his choices. The year of his quaestorship was marked by personal loss. His wife, Cornelia, died, leaving him with their young daughter, Julia. In the same period, his aunt Julia also passed away. Both funerals became public events. Roman funerals for prominent people were not quiet family affairs. They were opportunities to remind the living of the achievements of the dead and of the virtues they represented. The orations that accompanied such ceremonies were among the most important performances a man might give in his whole career. Caesar delivered the eulogy for his aunt in front of a large crowd. In doing so, he reminded everyone of her marriage to Gaius Marius and of the services that Marius had rendered to Rome. At a time when the Senate still edged nervously around the memory of that turbulent figure, it was a bold choice. He went further and allowed images of Marius to appear in public processions. These had been removed during Sulla's ascendancy, almost treated as though they were infected objects. Bringing them back was a neat piece of political theatre. It advertised his loyalty to his kin and to the popular cause, and it signalled to veterans of Marius and his supporters that there was a young member of the Julian clan who had not forgotten them. At Cornelia's funeral he struck a different tone, speaking more personally about her virtues and their life together. The speech touched many listeners and helped create an image of Caesar as a man capable of genuine feeling as well as ambition. In a culture that valued the ideal of the devoted husband and father, despite the rather flexible reality in many lives, this mattered. The public saw not only a clever prosecutor and rising senator, but also a widower who could speak movingly of his loss. After a suitable interval, he remarried. His new wife, Pompeia, was a granddaughter of Sulla through marriage into the Metellus family. On paper, this looked like an attempt to mend fences with elements of the conservative aristocracy. The union linked him to another network of influence and further entangled him in the complex web of Roman kinship. Socially, he moved comfortably in the circles of the elite, attending dinners where political deals were floated in between discussions of Greek philosophy and the merits of different vintages of wine. In the mid-60s, before the Common Era, he ran for the office of aedile and won. There were two types of aediles, and Caesar attained the curule aedileship, which carried higher status and greater expectations. Aediles were responsible for public buildings, markets, and most notably in the eyes of the populace, the organization of games and festivals. It was an excellent role for someone who understood the power of spectacle and who was willing to spend money he did not yet have. Caesar embraced the possibilities with enthusiasm. He put on games that people remembered for years. There were lavish processions, exotic animals in the arena, generous distributions of food, and elaborate decorations in the forum. He adorned the public spaces with so many garlands and temporary structures that people joked Rome had never looked so festive. All of this made him immensely popular among ordinary citizens, who were always delighted with free entertainment and treats. It also impressed many equestrians and lesser nobles who saw in him a man who knew how to win hearts. The cost was enormous. To pay for these extravagances, Caesar borrowed heavily. Creditors in Rome were not sentimental. They lent because they expected that the borrower would one day be in a position to repay them with interest and favors. In effect, he was betting that his future political success would be rich enough to cover the debts he was piling up. This was a common gamble among ambitious politicians, but few pushed it as far as he did. By the end of his aedileship, he was deeply in the red, though his public reputation had risen considerably. He also used the aedileship to continue the careful rehabilitation of the popular cause. During one set of games, he arranged for trophies associated with Marius's victories to be displayed once more in public. Older citizens who had served under that general, and younger men who had grown up on stories of his campaigns, reacted with unexpected emotion. They cheered, wept, and shouted Marius's name. The more conservative senators scowled, but the move could not be openly condemned. After all, Marius had defended Rome from foreign enemies. To criticize the memory of his success was to risk looking unpatriotic. 2 years later came a contest that would show just how far Caesar's ambition reached, and how skillfully he could mobilize support. In the year 63, he stood for the position of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. This was not simply a religious honor. The holder of the office lived in an official residence on the Forum and presided over many sacred rituals that touched every aspect of public life. The post was generally expected to go to an older, more established figure. In this case, Caesar's rivals were experienced and respectable men who no doubt assumed that the young aedile was aiming too high. Caesar campaigned with relentless energy. He appealed to every class he could reach, promising traditional piety to the devout and generous patronage to the ambitious. There are stories that his mother Aurelia helped organize canvassing, welcoming long lines of potential supporters into their house. He is said to have told friends that he would either return home as chief priest or not at all, meaning that the level of debt he had taken on to fund his campaign made any lesser outcome ruinous. On the day of the vote, to the surprise and dismay of many in the Senate, he won. He took up residence in the official house, a central and very visible location that made him almost a permanent feature of the Roman public scene. The victory confirmed what some had begun to suspect. This was not simply a clever and entertaining aedile. This was someone who could reach into the heart of Roman society and gather followers even against older and more established competitors. His tenure as Pontifex Maximus began in a year already filled with drama. That same year, the failed patrician Lucius Sergius Catilina, better known as Catiline, launched a conspiracy to seize power by violence. When the plot was uncovered, the Senate met in anxiety to debate what should be done with the conspirators who had been arrested in the city. Cicero, serving as consul, revealed the evidence and demanded strong measures. Cato the Younger argued vigorously for execution, insisting that the Republic must defend itself decisively. Caesar, speaking in the Senate, took a different line. He acknowledged the danger, but warned against setting a precedent of killing Roman citizens without trial in the proper assemblies. He proposed that the conspirators be imprisoned in distant Italian towns instead. His speech was calm and carefully reasoned. Some thought he was motivated by genuine concern for legality and mercy. Others suspected that he simply preferred to avoid giving the state such a dramatic example of bypassing normal procedures, in case he himself might one day be the target of emergency measures. Whatever his motives, the episode showed him as a man willing to stand against a wave of anger and argue for a more measured response. The Senate ultimately voted for execution, swayed by Cato and the urgency of the moment. The conspirators were strangled in the Tullianum prison, yet the memory of Caesar's stand lingered. Friends of liberty admired him for trying to restrain fear. Enemies muttered that he had been too soft on dangerous men. It would not be the last time that events in that chamber would be revisited and reinterpreted as his career advanced. In the next year, he served as praetor, an office that placed him among the senior magistrates and gave him responsibility for major cases and sometimes public order. He performed his duties without major incident, but with the same restless energy that marked his other roles. It was during this period that a scandal erupted that touched his private life and caused much amusement and outrage in the city. The rites of the Bona Dea, the good goddess, were performed each year in the house of a magistrate, attended only by women. Men were strictly forbidden from being present. In the year 62, the ceremony took place in the house of Caesar as Pontifex Maximus. His wife Pompeia hosted the event along with other prominent women. During the rites, a young nobleman named Publius Clodius reportedly disguised himself as a woman and slipped into the house, perhaps in an attempt to pursue a romantic encounter, perhaps as part of some reckless prank. He was discovered, and the resulting uproar was intense. Religion, politics, and scandal made a potent mixture. Clodius was prosecuted for sacrilege. Caesar claimed that he knew nothing about the intrusion, which may well have been true, but the affair made his household the subject of endless gossip. In the end, although Clodius escaped conviction through dubious means, Caesar decided to divorce Pompeia. When asked why, if he believed she was innocent, he gave a succinct explanation that Romans never forgot. He said that his wife must be free from suspicion. It was a neat expression of the idea that those who live in the center of public life are judged not only by their actions, but also by what others can plausibly imagine about them. Soon after his praetorship, Caesar received the governorship of Hispania Ulteria, further Spain. This province covered large areas in the south and west of the peninsula, and was rich in resources but still restless under Roman control. For Caesar, it offered several attractive prospects at once. A provincial command could yield military successes, which translated into prestige, and it could also provide income through legitimate taxes and, if one was less scrupulous, through the lightening of burdens in exchange for offerings. There was a complication. His debts in Rome were so extensive that his creditors initially tried to block his departure, fearing he would simply vanish into the provinces. It was only when Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in the city, stepped in as guarantor that Caesar was able to leave. Crassus's decision to back him was an early sign of an alignment that would have far-reaching consequences. For now, it meant that Caesar could join his new command with a sense of relief and obligation. In Spain, he moved quickly. He resolved outstanding disputes, enforced Roman authority where it had become lax, and led expeditions against tribes that had grown too bold. He won battles, took towns, and acquired enough victories to qualify for a formal celebration known as a triumph. A triumph was the highest military honor a Roman commander could receive, involving a spectacular procession through the city with captured enemies and spoils on display. As his term ended and he prepared to return to Rome, Caesar asked the Senate for permission to delay entering the city so that he could keep his command and his troops outside the sacred boundary, which was necessary to secure a triumph. At the same time, he wanted to stand for the consulship, the highest annual office in the Republic. Roman law required candidates to be physically present in the city. The two desires could not be reconciled under existing rules. Faced with this dilemma, he made a choice that revealed his priorities. Rather than cling to the chance of immediate military glory, he abandoned the claim to a triumph and crossed the boundary to present himself as a candidate for consul. Civil office was the key to longer-term influence. He could seek more triumphs later if he managed to secure the highest magistracies. It was a classic example of his willingness to sacrifice short-term spectacle for a greater strategic gain. By the time he entered the contest for the consulship of 59, Caesar had assembled a remarkable collection of advantages. He was head of an ancient family with divine legends attached to its name. He had the moral authority of the chief priesthood. He had a record of competent administration and successful command in Spain. He had cultivated the goodwill of the urban masses through games and public generosity. He had ties to the followers of Marius, connections to the Metellus clan, and the financial backing of Crassus. There remained another towering figure on the Roman stage, Gnaeus Pompeius, known as Pompey, whose victories in the east had made him the great darling of the moment. Pompey had his own frustrations with the Senate, which had been slow to ratify his arrangements and settle his veterans. Caesar saw that his own ambitions and Pompey's needs might fit together very neatly, especially if someone could provide the wealth and influence to knit such a partnership tightly. The idea of a new kind of political alliance was beginning to take shape, an understanding between men who might otherwise have been rivals. It would soon alter the balance of power in the Republic in ways that no one, not even those three men, could fully control. By the time Caesar returned from his command in Spain and set his sights on the consulship, Roman politics resembled a crowded dining room in which half the guests were arguing and the other half were pretending not to listen. The Senate wanted to preserve its dignity. The equestrian class wanted their investments protected. Veterans wanted land, and ordinary citizens wanted grain and a sense that someone in authority knew what they were doing. Over all of this hung the presence of two very rich and very powerful men who did not particularly like each other. One of them was Gnaeus Pompeius, whom everyone called Pompey. He had made his name very early, first in the civil wars and then in campaigns across the Mediterranean and the East. He had cleared the pirate problem with breathtaking speed and pushed Roman influence deep into Asia, settling kings, founding cities, and marching home to a thunder of applause. He was popular with the people and adored by his soldiers, but he had an awkward relationship with many senators who admired his victories and distrusted his power in roughly equal measure. The other was Marcus Licinius Crassus. If Pompey had glory, Crassus had money. He was renowned as the wealthiest man in Rome. He had made his fortune in property, careful loans, and the sort of business arrangements that quietly turned disaster into opportunity. During Sulla's time, he had bought confiscated property at knockdown prices. He ran a private fire service that had a curious habit of negotiating to buy a burning building while it was still on fire. He had also commanded troops and shared in the defeat of the slave uprising led by Spartacus. But his military record did not shine as brightly as Pompey's. There was a lingering rivalry between them, made worse by the way the public and the Senate often spoke of them as if they were two halves of a single problem. Both men had grievances. Pompey wanted land grants for his veterans, an official confirmation of the arrangements he had made in the East, particularly new settlements and royal alliances. Crassus wanted relief for the tax farming companies, many of which were owned by his equestrian associates and clients, who had bid too high on contracts in Asia and now faced ruin. The Senate, wary of being seen as bending to pressure from celebrity generals and wealthy financiers, delayed, watered down, or blocked these measures. Into this tangle stepped Caesar, preparing his bid for the consulship for the year 59. He was ambitious, heavily in debt, and very clear-eyed about the fact that success in Roman politics depended on assembling coalitions. He could see that Pompey and Crassus, although they cordially disliked one another, wanted many of the same things. He could also see that each feared the other enough to hesitate about acting alone. It took a certain kind of nerve to suggest that they might work together. Caesar had that nerve. He began by speaking with each man separately, listening more than he talked, and discovering that behind their rivalries they both shared a sense of being obstructed by a stubborn group of senators. Then he made the rather simple suggestion that if they aligned their interests instead of rubbing them together, they would be almost impossible to resist. If Crassus brought his wealth and influence, Pompey brought his army of veterans and prestige, and Caesar brought his talent for speaking and his access to the popular assemblies, they could control elections and legislation in a way that no single individual could manage. There was no formal treaty, no carved stone recording the terms. This was a private understanding among three men who knew how much they could gain and how much they might risk. Caesar secured their agreement that they would support his candidacy for consul, and that, once in office, he would see to it that Pompey's settlements and veterans would be taken care of, and that Crassus's allies would receive financial relief. In return, they would back his request for a substantial provincial command once his term ended, something large enough in scope to allow him to build a power base of his own. Later, historians would call this informal alliance the First Triumvirate, using a grand title that makes it sound like an official constitutional body. At the time, it was nothing of the sort. It was simply a pact, known to those who needed to know and suspected by many others, that three leading figures in Roman public life would act together. It succeeded in one of its first aims. Caesar won the election and became consul for the year 59. His colleague in that year was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a staunch conservative who, judging from the way the year unfolded, must often have felt as if he had been invited to a party, only to find everyone else. There was part of a different family. The consuls were meant to cooperate in leading the government. Caesar had other ideas. He saw the consulship not as a chair to share, but as a platform from which to push through the promises he had made and to launch his own longer-term plans. The most immediate task was to secure land for Pompey's veterans. Many soldiers who had campaigned in the East had been promised plots on their return. Such grants were a standard part of Roman military practice. They rewarded service, planted loyal colonists in strategic places, and pleased the generals who could present themselves as benefactors. The difficulty was always the same. Land did not appear from nowhere. Existing owners, especially wealthy ones, had a habit of resenting being turned out. Caesar proposed a land law that would use public land in Italy and funds from the Eastern campaigns to provide farms for the veterans and some poorer citizens. He insisted that the terms were moderate and fair. The Senate, alerted by conservative leaders, argued that the measure was a populist attempt to buy support and that it might unsettle property rights. When it became clear that the Senate was going to block the proposal or strip it of meaning, Caesar took it to the popular assembly. As consul, he had the right to present laws to the people. In the forum, surrounded by crowds, he asked whether they supported his proposal. Pompey and Crassus were present and expressed their approval openly. Many citizens cheered. When Bibulus tried to proclaim that he was observing unfavorable omens, a traditional way of halting public business, he was jostled and driven back by the crowd. The law was passed amid shouting and confusion. It was a decisive moment. Caesar had made it clear that when the Senate would not cooperate, he was willing to appeal directly to the people. From that point on, the year became a contest between him and the conservative bloc. Bibulus tried repeatedly to use his religious authority to declare days invalid for public meetings. At one point, he retreated from active public life altogether, announcing that he would spend the rest of his term observing the sky for signs from the gods. It was an act of protest, intended to underline his view that Caesar was trampling sacred procedure. Instead, it made him look ineffectual. Romans with a taste for sharp humor began to say that the year was not the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but of Julius and Caesar, as if one man had managed to hold both offices. Caesar did not limit himself to land reform. He arranged for Pompey's eastern settlements to be confirmed, giving legal security to the cities and kingdoms that had come under Roman influence during his campaigns. He pushed through arrangements that eased the strain on the tax contracts in Asia, which pleased Crassus and the equestrian companies. He required provincial governors to publish detailed accounts before and after their terms, in an effort to make extortion more visible. Some of these measures were practical reforms. All of them increased the sense that he was on the side of those who had felt blocked by senatorial obstruction. Marriage served as another kind of glue within this alliance. Caesar arranged for his only child, his daughter Julia, to marry Pompey. The match surprised many, since Pompey had been expected to marry into another powerful clan for strategic reasons of his own. Julia was much younger than Pompey, but by all accounts the marriage was affectionate as well as political. At the same time, Caesar married again, taking Calpurnia, the daughter of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, as his wife. Piso would later become consul and serve as an ally. Family life in Rome was rarely simple. Here, it intertwined with political calculation in a way that would have lasting consequences. As his term as consul drew to a close, Caesar addressed the matter that mattered most to him personally. He did not want the usual short and modest provincial assignment that followed for many consuls. He wanted something that would allow him to command several legions for a considerable period. With support from Pompey and Crassus, and with the help of a compliant tribune, Publius Vatinius, a law was passed that granted him command over Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum for 5 years, along with a number of legions funded by the state. Later, Transalpine Gaul was added as well. These territories were not quiet backwaters. Cisalpine Gaul, the region of northern Italy beyond the river Rubicon, was vital to the security of the peninsula. Illyricum, along the eastern Adriatic coast, was strategically important and occasionally volatile. Transalpine Gaul, beyond the Alps, bordered lands that were restless and sometimes hostile. With these provinces came the opportunity for campaigns, discoveries, and immense expansion of both Roman power and Caesar's personal standing. When his consulship ended, he left Rome under a cloud of resentment in the Senate and a great deal of enthusiasm among his supporters. His enemies muttered about the legality of his arrangements. His allies toasted the arrangement that sent him away with an army and left Pompey and Crassus to manage affairs in the city. None of them could fully foresee how completely the balance of power would tilt in the decade to come. While Caesar marched north to take up his new duties, politics in Rome continued its usual frantic dance. Street politics became more violent, with gangs associated with men like Clodius and Milo battling in the Forum and on the roads. Pompey remained a central figure, acting as a sort of informal guardian of order, while Crassus maintained his networks of influence and wealth. For a time, the alliance held in a loose fashion. Each man had his own sphere. Caesar was in Gaul, writing letters, sending reports, and building a reputation with each success. Pompey stayed in Italy, managing courts and law and acting as the visible face of authority. Crassus watched the world with a calculating eye, aware that he was now the least celebrated of the three in military terms. By the mid-50s, strain began to show. The death of Julia, who died in childbirth, removed a gentle human bridge between Caesar and Pompey. The loss was personal and political. Pompey had genuinely cared for her, and her presence had softened tensions between her father and her husband. Without that family connection, it became easier for men around them to whisper suspicions and to encourage rivalry. At the same time, the triumphs of Caesar in Gaul were starting to overshadow Pompey's earlier achievements in the public imagination back in Italy. News of the crossing of rivers, the subduing of tribes, the building of bridges and forts, and the extension of Roman borders stirred the popular imagination. Caesar's commentaries, carefully written and circulated, encouraged this fascination. Pompey, who had once been the unrivaled darling of the Roman crowd, now shared the spotlight with a man who was still away but whose deeds were spoken of daily. Recognizing that their arrangement needed attention, the three men agreed to meet in person at the town of Lucca in northern Italy in the year 56. The meeting drew so many senators and equestrians that it resembled a traveling capital. The message was plain. These three could still gather most of the significant players of Roman public life around a single table if they wished. At Lucca, they renewed their understanding. Caesar's command in Gaul would be extended, securing his position there for another term. Pompey and Crassus would stand for the consulship together and, if elected, would use their time in office to grant themselves substantial provincial commands afterward. Pompey was to receive the Spanish provinces, which he could govern through legates while remaining in Italy, and Crassus would be given Syria, with its wealth and its border with the Parthian Empire. The plan made sense on paper. It offered all three men fresh opportunities and kept them aligned. In practice, it also increased the scale of the potential disaster. Caesar would grow more powerful in Gaul. Pompey would control the resources of Spain. Crassus would have a chance to win the kind of military glory that he had always envied in others. At the same time, each would become more dependent on the others not turning against him. Pompey and Crassus did indeed win the joint consulship for the year 55. They passed measures that extended Caesar's command and secured their own provincial assignments, though not without facing violent opposition in the streets and bitter debate in the Senate. For Crassus, Syria held the promise of enormous profits and a stage on which to outshine even Pompey if he could win a spectacular victory against the eastern power of Parthia. He set out with a large army, full of optimism and confidence. The Parthian Empire, heir to earlier Eastern kingdoms, was not a trivial opponent. It was skilled in cavalry warfare and had its own proud traditions. The campaign that followed did not go as Crassus expected. At Carrhae, in the flat country, near the Mesopotamian frontier, his army was drawn into a battle that played to Parthian strengths. Their horse archers harassed the Roman legions, staying out of reach and wearing them down with showers of arrows. Heavy cavalry delivered sudden, crushing charges. Roman square formations, so effective against many enemies, found themselves surrounded in a wide open landscape. The result was a disaster. Crassus's son Publius, who had shown considerable promise as a commander, was killed, and his head was displayed by the Parthians to demoralize the Romans. Crassus himself was eventually killed during a parley that turned violent. Thousands of Roman soldiers were captured, some of whom were later rumored to have been settled far away on eastern frontiers. The Parthians captured legionary standards, the symbolic eagles that represented the honor of the units. The loss of those standards stung the Roman psyche for decades. Crassus's death removed one of the three supports from the alliance. What had been a triangle became a line between Caesar and Pompey, with the memory of their absent partner hovering over every decision. In Rome, the news of the defeat at Carrhae shook confidence. People who had regarded these three as almost foolproof discovered that one of them could make a mistake, from which there was no recovery. At the same time, the political climate in the city deteriorated. Street violence between rival gangs reached such levels that the Senate turned to Pompey to restore order. In the year 52, after the death of Clodius, in a brawl on the Appian Way, riots erupted, and the Senate took the unusual step of appointing Pompey as sole consul for a period. It was a sign of trust and desperation. Officially, he was meant to act as a stabilizing force and then step back into the normal pattern of dual consulship. Unofficially, he now stood in a position of unrivaled authority within Italy. Pompey used his time as sole consul to pass laws concerned with public order and elections. He also tightened links with conservative senators by marrying Cornelia, the daughter of Metellus Scipio, who would later share the consulship with him. The personal connection that had once tied him to Caesar through Julia was gone. In its place were new bonds with men who regarded Caesar's growing power with alarm. Meanwhile, Caesar continued to campaign in Gaul, sending back reports, wealth, and occasional gifts to friends in Rome, but remaining physically separated from the center of politics. His enemies, gathered around men like Cato and increasingly around Pompey's circle, began to argue that his term of command should end and that he should return to Rome as an ordinary private citizen to face whatever prosecutions might be brought against him. They knew that once he crossed the boundary without his legions, he would be vulnerable. They also knew that as long as he remained in Gaul with his loyal troops, he could not easily be compelled to accept their terms. What had begun some years earlier as a clever arrangement between three ambitious men had now turned into something very different. One was dead in the east, his dream of surpassing the others scattered with his army on a distant plain. One stood in Rome, at the head of the Senate's efforts to preserve the existing order. The third watched from the northern provinces, weighing letters and edicts and quietly counting the number of soldiers who would follow him wherever he chose to go. The first triumvirate, which had seemed to gather the strands of Roman power into a single braided rope, was unraveling. The outcome of that process would be decided not in the Senate House, but on fields far from the city and on a frontier river that marked the edge of Italy itself. When Caesar took up his new command north of Italy, he stepped into a world that Romans still thought of as half foreign and half opportunity. Beyond the tidy line of the river Rubicon and the Alpine passes, lay a patchwork of peoples whom Romans grouped under the convenient label of Gauls. In reality, there were dozens of tribes with their own languages, loyalties, and grudges, living in forests, river valleys, and fortified hill settlements. Rome already controlled northern Italy, up to the Alps, and it claimed influence in parts of southern Gaul, where Greek colonies dotted the coast. But the lands beyond were not yet securely bound into the Republic's complicated embrace. For an ambitious governor with several legions at his disposal, this frontier was a stage on which reputation and riches could be made very quickly. Caesar inherited a situation that was already tense. One of the first problems to land on his desk came from a people called the Helvetii. They lived in the region that would one day be known as Switzerland, in valleys and mountain slopes that were beautiful in a rugged way and difficult for farming. According to Caesar's account, their leaders decided that their homeland was too cramped and that they would all migrate west in a vast, organized movement to seek roomier lands near the Atlantic. They burned their villages and crops behind them to prevent any thought of turning back and set out with families, wagons, and herds, a human river that threatened to roll across Roman routes and allied territories. The Helvetian plan might have sounded reasonable in the Longhouses, where it was first discussed. From the Roman point of view, it looked like a disaster in the making. A mass migration of armed people could destabilize every region it touched. Allies might be trampled or tempted. Trade routes could be blocked. Caesar saw both risk and opportunity. If he could stop this moving nation and direct its people where he wished, he would not only protect Roman interests, but also display his usefulness in dramatic fashion. He moved quickly to block the easiest routes through the Roman province, along the river Rhone, building earthworks and a stout barrier from the river to the lake at Geneva. Then, when the Helvetii tried alternative paths, he trailed them, harassed their columns, and looked for a decisive way to halt them. The clash came near a place called Bibracte. The Helvetii, who were experienced fighters, formed their wagons into a defensive circle and prepared to resist. Caesar deployed his legions carefully, using the discipline and flexibility of the Roman line to press the Gauls from several directions. The battle was hard fought, with the Romans advancing uphill at one point and the Helvetii counterattacking with stubborn courage. In the end, the Roman formations held and ground their opponents down. Caesar pursued the survivors, forcing surrendered groups to give hostages and agree to his terms. He then ordered the Helvetii to return to their original lands, which would now serve Rome as a useful buffer zone on the frontier. The decision neatly solved the immediate issue and created a living wall between the province and other restless tribes. Hardly had the dust settled from this migration when another problem arose, this time from across the river Rhine. A Germanic ruler named Ariovistus had brought his warriors west into Gaul at the invitation of certain tribes who wanted help against their neighbors. Once established, Ariovistus showed no intention of leaving. He demanded land, tribute, and hostages, and his growing presence frightened both Romans and Gauls. The Roman Senate had once recognized him as a friend and ally when it suited them. But by the time Caesar reached his provinces, that recognition had become a liability. Caesar summoned Ariovistus to negotiations, speaking as the representative of a power that claimed to arbitrate disputes in the region. Ariovistus refused to come, then agreed to meet under heavily controlled conditions, and finally made it clear that he considered Gaul his hunting ground as much as Rome's. The mood between the two men hardened. When news spread that Ariovistus was moving his forces and threatening Roman allies, Caesar called a council of war. Some of his officers, unsettled by tales of German ferocity and the unfamiliar fighting style of their long-haired enemies, were less than enthusiastic. Caesar responded with one of those brisk addresses that appear in ancient histories, promising that he would march even with a single legion if necessary. Pride and shame did their work. The legions moved. The battle with Ariovistus took place near the Upper Rhine. The Germans had their families with them and fought with the determination of men who know there is no safe place to retreat. The Romans advanced in their usual ordered ranks, shields overlapping, standards bobbing above the lines. The Germans charged with terrifying energy, but their formations were less disciplined than those of the legions. And once the initial impact was absorbed, Roman training and flexibility began to tell. Caesar shifted reserves to threatened points, encouraged his officers by name, and gradually turned the struggle into a rout. Ariovistus escaped across the Rhine with a handful of followers. Many of his men died. All were scattered. The message to both Gauls and Germans was clear. Rome would not permit a rival power to set up shop in its near abroad. With these early campaigns, Caesar established two important things. First, he showed that his presence meant a change in the balance of power in Gaul. Tribes that had long feuded with one another now had to calculate how their choices would look in the eyes of a Roman commander who seemed to arrive wherever trouble was thickest. Second, he began to create the story of these events in his own words. During the winters, when the snows and rains made large campaigns impractical, he dictated detailed accounts of his operations, later known as his commentary on the war in Gaul. The opening sentence of that work famously divides Gaul into three parts, and in a typically neat flourish, note that one of those parts is inhabited by people whom the Romans call Gauls and others call Celts. It was more than simple geography. It was a literary curtain rising on a long performance in which he was both actor and narrator. The next phase of the war drew him north toward the peoples collectively called the Belgae. In his own words, they were the bravest of the Gauls, which was both a compliment and a warning. They lived in what is now roughly Belgium and parts of northern France, in a landscape of rivers, marshes, and forests. Several of their tribes joined together in a large coalition when they realized that Roman presence on their borders would soon become Roman demands. Caesar gathered his legions and advanced to meet them, building fortified camps at the end of each day's march, as Roman armies always did, and making careful use of scouts and intelligence. One of the early major clashes took place near the river Ain. There the Belgae tried to force the Romans into a disadvantageous position, attacking across marshy ground and threatening a bridge that was crucial to Caesar's supply line. He responded by digging trenches, throwing up small forts, and using a mixture of infantry and cavalry to blunt their attacks. The battle lasted long enough to test his command structure thoroughly. In the end, when the Belgae realized that they were not going to break the Roman line and that their own supplies were running low, they dispersed. Caesar pursued them tribe by tribe, accepting some surrenders and storming other positions where the defenders insisted on resisting. Among the more dramatic episodes in this northern campaign was the siege of a people called the Aduatuci, who had retreated into a stronghold on a hill. Confident in the strength of their walls and height, they mocked the Roman engineers as they began to build ramps and towers. It was a typical Gallic habit to rely on the natural strength of high ground, and a typical Roman habit to treat hills as temporary inconveniences that could be shaved away with wood, earth, and sweat. Slowly, the Roman siege works crept closer. When the Aduatuci finally saw the tall towers being rolled against them, they offered surrender, then attempted a night attack to break out. It failed. The stronghold fell, and Caesar distributed the survivors among his allies and soldiers as captives. It was a harsh conclusion, and his own account of it is cool and matter-of-fact. While these ground campaigns unfolded, Caesar also discovered that not all problems in Gaul could be handled by the same formula of march, entrench, and fight. On the Atlantic coast lived a group known as the Veneti, skilled seafarers who controlled important harbours and trade routes. They used sturdy, high-sided ships that were better suited to the rough Atlantic waters than the lighter vessels of the Mediterranean. When they resisted Roman demands and took Roman envoys prisoner, Caesar had to improvise. He ordered one of his legates, Decimus Brutus, to build a fleet that could match the Veneti at sea. The naval battle that followed off the coast of Brittany showed Roman adaptability. The Veneti's ships had tough leather sails and strong rigging, which made them resilient but less nimble. The Roman crews devised hooks to grab and sever the rigging lines, collapsing the enemy sails and leaving their ships dead in the water. Once immobilized, the proud vessels were boarded in close combat, where Roman infantry excelled. The defeat of the Veneti did more than remove a rebellious tribe. It sent a signal along the coast that the newcomers from the south were willing to learn new crafts and fight on any element that was required. Caesar was not content with securing obedience on one side of the Rhine. At least part of his mind was always on the broader map. Having driven Ariovistus back, he decided to cross the river himself in a demonstration that would impress both friends and potential enemies. Rather than relying solely on boats, he had his engineers construct a timber bridge over the fast-flowing water. The project was as much an exhibition as a practical measure. Huge piles were driven into the riverbed, beams laid across, and the structure completed in an astonishingly short time. His legions marched over, spent several days moving through the territory of nearby Germanic tribes, made their presence very clear, and then withdrew. The bridge was dismantled behind them. The message was simple and, in its way, courteous. Rome could come over whenever it wanted, but at the moment, it chose not to stay. If the Rhine invited Caesar to look east, the narrow sea beyond Gaul drew his eyes in another direction. Across that water lay Britain, an island known to Greeks and Romans more from travellers, tales and trade rumour than from direct experience by large armies. There were trading links through Gallic middlemen, and some Gallic tribes had ties with their cousins across the sea. For Caesar, exploration and prestige mixed smoothly. A limited expedition would punish those Britons who had aided his Gallic opponents, show Roman reach, and provide material for future boasting. The first crossing took place in the late summer of the year 55, before the Common Era. Wind and tides proved less cooperative than they had seemed on the map. The Roman fleet struggled to anchor near the coast of Kent. British warriors with painted bodies and chariots gathered on the beaches, throwing javelins and shouting insults. The Roman soldiers, not keen on jumping down into deep water in full armor under fire, hesitated until standard-bearers, in a burst of theatrical courage, leaped out and waded ashore, calling their comrades to follow. The landing was messy but successful. Caesar managed to establish a small presence, win a few skirmishes, and extract hostages from local leaders. Then a storm wrecked many of his ships, reminding everyone that this was an unfamiliar and treacherous environment. After some hurried repairs and negotiations, he withdrew to the continent. He was not satisfied. The following year he returned with a larger fleet and more cavalry. This time he pushed farther inland, forcing more tribes to submit and give hostages. He noted the dense forests, the different customs, and the use of iron currency, rings, instead of conventional coinage among some groups. Yet he did not try to hold territory permanently. The weather, supply difficulties, and the constant need to maintain control in Gaul made a permanent conquest unrealistic. Still, the fact remained. A Roman army had crossed and returned. For the citizens back home, who read his reports with a mixture of pride and curiosity, Britain moved from the realm of myth into the sphere of Roman concern. Back on the mainland, the strain on the Gallic peoples was growing. Year after year, they saw Roman camps, demands for supplies, and the presence of foreign soldiers in their fields and towns. Caesar was efficient, but he was not gentle. He imposed terms, levied troops from allied tribes, and took hostages to ensure compliance. During the winter, he often scattered his legions across wide areas, placing them in separate quarters in different territories. Strategically, this allowed him to keep an eye on several regions at once, and to punish or assist communities quickly. From the Gallic point of view, however, it was an intrusion that built resentment. One of the most serious explosions of that resentment came from a people called the Eburones, under a chieftain named Ambiorix. Caesar had sent legions under his lieutenants Sabinus and Cotta to winter among them. At first, relations seemed stable. Then Ambiorix, playing the role of the friendly ally, approached the Roman camp with a tale. A great coalition, he said, was forming, and a vast Gallic force was coming to destroy the isolated legions. Out of concern for their safety, he advised Sabinus and Cotta to abandon their camp and march to a larger Roman force nearby. The two Roman commanders debated the story. Cotta argued for staying put behind fortifications, noting that Roman camps were designed to withstand surprise attacks. Sabinus, possibly more nervous by nature or more trusting of Ambiorix, pushed for movement. In the end, they agreed to leave, marching out in a long column with baggage and families in tow. It was exactly what Ambiorix wanted. Not far from the camp, the column entered a narrow valley where hills closed in on both sides. There the Gallic warriors sprang their trap. Missiles rained down from higher ground. The Romans, caught in a twisting path and unable to deploy properly, took heavy casualties. They formed a makeshift defensive circle, but the situation was hopeless. Ambiorix tried clever tactics, shifting between attacks and offers of parley, wearing down Roman resistance and trust. In the end, Sabinus attempted to negotiate and was killed. Cotta died fighting. The column was destroyed almost to a man. News of this calamity spread quickly. In another winter camp, a legion commanded by Quintus Cicero, the brother of the famous orator, found itself under siege by neighboring tribes encouraged by Ambiorix's success. They built their own earthworks and towers, learning from Roman methods, and pressed the garrison hard. Messages were sent out by night through enemy lines, carried by brave Gallic allies and Roman scouts who risked everything to slip between guard posts. One of these reached Caesar. He responded with the speed that had already become his trademark. Gathering a relief force from the nearest legions, he marched through poor weather and over difficult roads, arriving near the besieged camp faster than his enemies expected. Using clever tricks of campfires and movements to give the impression of a larger army, he lured the besiegers into ill-judged attacks, then counterattacked with precision. The siege was broken. The Gauls fled. Caesar entered Cicero's battered camp to embrace exhausted soldiers who had eaten leather and endured sleepless nights waiting for rescue. The revenge on Ambiorix and his people was severe. Caesar launched a punitive campaign designed not only to punish, but to make future rebels think twice. The lands of the Eburones were systematically devastated. Small Roman detachments swept through villages, destroying crops and seizing livestock. Neighboring tribes were encouraged to join in the looting. Ambiorix himself vanished into the forests and was never captured, but his people were scattered. Caesar's own comment on the matter is laconic, but the effect was that one more part of Gaul was left shattered, its survivors painfully aware of the costs of rebellion. For all these incidents, it was clear that the Gallic resistance was not yet broken. Local revolts and conspiracies continued to flicker, and somewhere in the central highlands, a leader emerged who understood that only a broad and coordinated effort had any hope of success. His name was Vercingetorix, a noble from the Arverni people. He was young, determined, and serious. According to the stories, he was initially turned away by some of his own elders who thought him too radical, but he gathered a band of followers, seized control, and began to speak of uniting the Gauls in a single effort to push out the Romans. Vercingetorix proved to be a rare combination, a charismatic figure who also grasped the practical requirements of warfare. He imposed strict discipline on his followers. Those who disobeyed his orders could expect harsh punishment. He adopted a strategy that hurt his own people in the short term, but aimed to starve the invader. Villages and farms in the path of the Roman advance were burned to prevent Caesar from feeding his legions. Only a few key strongholds were spared as potential centers of resistance. One of those was the town of Avaricum, in the territory of the Bituriges, a rich settlement surrounded by marsh and river on 3 sides, and a man-made wall on the 4th. Vercingetorix argued that it should be destroyed like the others, but the locals begged to keep their home, insisting that it was impregnable. He reluctantly agreed. Caesar, attracted by the challenge and the prospect of supplies, set his legions to work. They built massive siege terraces and towers, protecting themselves from sorties with shelters and counterworks. The siege dragged on through cold and hunger, with the Romans short of food and the defenders hurling insults from the walls. Finally, after weeks of labor, the Roman engines battered a breach and the assault went in. The town fell. The soldiers, furious at the suffering they had endured and unwilling to take chances with future resistance, killed the vast majority of the inhabitants. Caesar writes of the numbers with chilling detachment. For him, it was a necessary severity. For the Gallic survivors, it was a memory that would feed hatred for generations. Not every campaign went Caesar's way. At the hill town of Gergovia, in the heartland of the Arverni, he suffered a setback. The site was well chosen, with steep slopes and strong walls. Complicated maneuvers, misunderstandings among officers, and the enthusiasm of troops who pressed an attack too far without clear orders led to confusion. The Gauls, fighting on ground they knew intimately, counterattacked. Several Roman cohorts were driven back in disorder, casualties mounted. Caesar was forced to withdraw. It was a sharp check to his aura of invincibility and a valuable boost to Gallic morale. The final and most famous confrontation came at Alesia. After further maneuvering and skirmishing, Vercingetorix led his forces into this fortified hilltop settlement in the territory of the Mandubi. He believed that from this stronghold, supplied by allies and protected by earthworks, he could hold out while a larger relief army gathered. Caesar, unwilling to let such a leader slip away or remain as a symbol of resistance, chose to surround him. The result was one of the most remarkable engineering feats of ancient warfare. Caesar's legions built a continuous line of fortifications around Alesia, complete with ditches, walls, towers, and traps. Then, anticipating the arrival of Gallic forces from outside, they constructed a second line facing outward. In effect, the Romans sat between two concentric rings of earth and timber. Inside the inner ring, Vercingetorix and his warriors watched supplies dwindle. Outside the outer ring, Gallic allies gathered in a growing relief army, drawn from many tribes that still hoped for a decisive blow against Rome. The siege turned into a test of endurance and nerve. The relief forces launched repeated assaults on the outer Roman line, trying to break through at weak points or at night. The defenders inside made sorties against the inner fortifications, hoping to coordinate an escape with their friends outside. Roman soldiers ran from sector to sector, plugging gaps, counter-attacking, and relying on the solidity of their earthworks. Cavalry charges under trusted officers, including men like Labienus, who had been with Caesar from the start, threw back dangerous breakthroughs. For several days the outcome hung in the balance. Had either Roman line fully buckled, the army could have been crushed between hammer and anvil. In the end, disciplined labor and the stubborn cohesion of the legions carried the day. The relief army, exhausted and demoralized by repeated failures, broke and scattered. Vercingetorix, seeing that no rescue was coming and that his people faced starvation, made a choice that would be remembered for its dramatic clarity. He rode out from Alesia, dressed in his finest armor, circled Caesar's position, dismounted, and placed his weapons at the Roman commander's feet. Whether or not the scene looked exactly as later artists imagined it, the essential fact remains. The leader of the Gallic revolt surrendered. With Alesia, organized resistance in Gaul effectively collapsed. There were still mopping up operations, smaller revolts, and punitive expeditions, but the central fact was now clear. Roman authority, backed by the legions, had imposed itself across the region. The human cost had been enormous. Ancient sources speak of hundreds of thousands killed or enslaved. Even if Caesar inflated the numbers to impress readers back home, the scale of disruption was undeniable. Tribes were broken, lands burned, populations moved. At the same time, roads, markets, and new administrative structures began to knit the territory more closely to Italy. In the long run, the descendants of those who had fought against Caesar would speak Latin, serve in Roman armies, and send senators to Rome. For Caesar himself, the rewards were immediate. He had transformed his provinces from awkward borderlands into a vast source of revenue and manpower. His soldiers were fiercely devoted to him, veterans of campaigns where his decisions had meant life or death. They had seen him share their hardships, stand in the front ranks in moments of crisis, and distribute rich spoils after each victory. They called him simply their general, with a mixture of respect, fear, and affection. Every year that he remained in Gaul, his power grew. In Rome, the picture looked rather different. Senators read his commentaries with a mixture of admiration and unease. The victories were good for Roman pride and very good for commerce, but behind every triumphal sentence lay the fact that one man now controlled a hardened army, far from the direct supervision of the Senate. Some praised him as the defender of the Republic's borders. Others muttered that he was preparing to do in Italy what he had done in Gaul. As winter settled once more over the forests and fields of the north, Caesar sat in his headquarters writing, reading reports, and trading letters with friends and enemies in the capital. The wars in Gaul were, for practical purposes, won. The next contest would be fought over something more intangible but just as real as any hilltop or river crossing, the question of who would command Rome itself. When Caesar first saw Alexandria, he was arriving as a man in pursuit, not as a tourist. He had sailed after arrival across the Mediterranean, following the messy business of civil war, and he expected to find another round of negotiations and battles. Instead, he stepped into a city that looked and felt like another planet compared to Rome. Alexandria was the dream of Alexander of Macedon made stone. It had a rational grid of streets, long colonnades that marched in straight lines, and a harbour that looked like someone had designed it with map-making in mind. There were scholars arguing about philosophy, merchants shouting in a mix of Greek and Egyptian, sailors from half the known world, and somewhere behind all that, a royal palace where a family with an imagination for drama and poison tried to rule a country that had been old when Rome was a collection of huts. The ruling house was Macedonian by origin and Egyptian by ambition. Its members liked grand names and tended to reuse them. As a result, by the time Caesar arrived, the family tree was full of people called Ptolemy and Cleopatra, many of whom had married each other and then tried to kill one another. It was an arrangement that kept the royal bloodline conveniently concentrated and made family dinners tense. The current official ruler in Alexandria was a boy named Ptolemy, who was not yet in his teens. Technically, he shared power with his older sister Cleopatra, who had once been the dominant partner but had recently been forced out. Courtiers around the boy king had pushed her aside, accusing her of all the usual crimes that ambitious relatives invented when they wanted someone removed from the palace. She had vanished into the interior of Egypt with a small following and a great deal of annoyance. Cleopatra was not the stereotypical queen of legend in quite the way later art imagined. Contemporary coins and portraits suggest a strong nose, a keen jawline, and intelligent eyes rather than delicate perfection. What made her remarkable, according to ancient writers, was her presence. She spoke several languages, including Egyptian, which was unusual for members of her dynasty, who often preferred to pretend that the local population existed only as a backdrop. She was quick-witted, musical, and entirely at ease in conversation. She understood that power in a court was not just a matter of troops, but of being able to charm, unsettle, and persuade the people in front of you. When Caesar arrived, the people in charge of the young Ptolemy tried to impress him with a display that they thought would solve one problem immediately. They presented him with the severed head of the rival he had been chasing and waited for applause. Instead, Caesar looked at the grim trophy with a mixture of disgust and cold calculation. On one hand, his most persistent opponent was dead. On the other, he was now faced with the fact that men who murdered guests on their own shoreline might not be subtle partners in politics. Into this already complicated situation, Cleopatra needed to re-enter the game. She was in exile but not defeated. Somewhere along the Nile, she gathered troops and supporters. The problem was how to get close enough to Caesar to make her case. The palace was firmly in the hands of the boy king's advisors, who had no interest in letting an older, eloquent queen anywhere near their new Roman visitor. This is where the most famous story of her ingenuity appears. According to one version, she had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled up in a carpet or bundled in a sack of bedding. The package was delivered to Caesar, who unwrapped it to find not a pile of laundry, but a young queen who had taken the trouble to arrive in person. Whether the exact details are true or not, the essential point stands. She contrived to meet Caesar privately and made an impression that changed the balance of power in Egypt. The two of them had a great deal to discuss. Cleopatra wanted her throne back, with more security than she had enjoyed before. Caesar wanted Egypt stable and grateful, a useful ally at the mouth of the Nile rather than a troublesome client. The conversations that followed would have mixed business with personal chemistry. Cleopatra was in her early 20s, Caesar in his early 50s, at the height of his fame after years in Gaul. Both were used to being the most interesting person in any room. Alexandrian politics did not pause to allow romance to take its course in peace. The men around Ptolemy understood very quickly that they were losing control of the situation. If Caesar supported Cleopatra, their own positions would evaporate. Tension hardened, small incidents escalated, and before long the city became a battlefield. Caesar found himself with a relatively small force, holed up in parts of the palace district and harbour, facing Egyptian troops who knew the terrain far better than his men did. The fighting that followed is often called the Alexandrian War, and it was not one of Caesar's more comfortable campaigns. Egyptian forces tried to cut him off from water, control the harbours, and starve him out. Caesar responded with a mix of ingenuity and stubbornness. He fortified sections of the city, seized or burned ships to prevent them falling into enemy hands, and used the geography of the harbour to his advantage. At one point, fires that had been set to block or destroy ships spread into nearby dockside buildings and warehouses. Later tradition linked this with damage to the Great Library, that legendary collection of scrolls. The ancient sources are not precise on the extent of that damage, but they make clear that the fighting in the harbour caused destruction that horrified many onlookers. For residents of Alexandria, seeing parts of their proud city in flames as two foreign-backed factions fought must have felt like being trapped in someone else's quarrel. Cleopatra stayed close to the center of events. She was not simply a symbol to be installed once victory was achieved. She knew the local factions, the loyalties of nobles and priests, and the fragile fabric that held Egypt together. Her presence at Caesar's side gave him access to that insight. His presence beside her gave her the authority of Roman arms. It was a partnership that combined practical advantage with personal attraction. The turning point came when reinforcements finally arrived for Caesar, in the form of troops brought by his officers from neighboring regions. With fresh soldiers and renewed supplies, he was able to move out of his cramped positions and take the fight into the open. The decisive encounter took place near the Nile. Egyptian forces, including those loyal to Ptolemy, tried to block him. The battle saw Roman infantry, seasoned by years in Gaul, holding firm against chariots and riverside assaults. At some point in the confusion, the young king's boat capsized as he attempted to flee. His body was later found, drowned in the river that was the lifeblood of his kingdom. With that, resistance in Alexandria collapsed. Caesar installed Cleopatra as queen, formally pairing her with another younger brother, Ptolemy, who was a child. It was the sort of arrangement that looked suitably traditional on Egyptian documents, while leaving no doubt in anyone's mind that Cleopatra was the real power. For added stability, it was convenient for local audiences to imagine that the Roman general had now become the protector, and perhaps the partner of their queen in a sense deeper than diplomatic. The months that followed included one of the more languid episodes in Caesar's busy life. He and Cleopatra took a trip up the Nile, a royal progress into the interior of Egypt. The Nile Valley in flood season must have been a startling sight for a man used to the rocky hills of Italy and the forests of Gaul. Fields of grain stretched away from the river in luminous green. Villages clung to the higher ground, and ancient temples rose above them, covered in hieroglyphs that no Roman scholar could fully read. On the royal barge, Cleopatra presided over a traveling court, where Greek, Egyptian, and now Latin voices mingled. There would have been music, feasting, and long conversations, as the current carried them past monuments that had watched over more dynasties than anyone could easily count. For the Egyptian population lining the banks, this was a familiar kind of spectacle, a queen visible on the water. For Caesar, it was a chance to see a kingdom whose time as an independent power was quietly running out, even as it still dazzled with gold and ceremony. During or shortly after this period, Cleopatra became pregnant. In the summer of the year 47 before the Common Era, she gave birth to a son whom she named Ptolemy, with an additional name that left no doubt about the identity she wished to claim for his father. The boy was called Caesarion, Little Caesar. In Egyptian representations, he would appear as a child king beside his mother, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Caesar never publicly acknowledged the boy as his heir in Roman law. That would have been a step too far for many in the city that still pretended it did not like monarchs. Yet the connection was plain enough to anyone who looked. Cleopatra had every reason to promote that link. A child who combined Macedonian royal blood with the name of Rome's rising star was a valuable asset in any game of dynasties. Caesar could not remain in Egypt indefinitely. Events elsewhere required his attention. Trouble in the eastern provinces and unfinished business with local rulers drew him away, and he left Alexandria with Cleopatra firmly seated on the throne. He departed with the warm support of a grateful queen and the knowledge that he had placed a friendly regime at a vital point on the map. Cleopatra, for her part, ruled from Alexandria with an eye on both the Nile and the wider Mediterranean. She handled internal revolts, balanced the interests of Egyptian priests and Greek administrators, and kept a close watch on Roman politics. She understood perfectly well that her own security depended on the fortunes of the man who had just departed and on the broader currents running through the Republic. At some point after Caesar's eastern campaigns, Cleopatra traveled to Rome with her son. She did not march in triumphal processions or sit openly in assemblies. That would have been too much for Roman sensibilities. Instead, she resided in a villa outside the formal boundaries of the city, likely on the far side of the Tiber, where foreign dignitaries could stay without disturbing the delicate rituals that governed who was allowed to be where. Her presence was a sensation. Romans were used to embassies and visiting kings, but a reigning queen from Egypt who was rumored to be the companion of their leading general and who arrived with a child called Caesarion was another matter. Some watched her with fascination, noting her style of dress, her retinue, and her calm self-possession. Others regarded her as an unwelcome symbol of foreign entanglements, an Eastern monarch who whispered to their most powerful citizen. In a striking gesture, Caesar arranged for a statue of Cleopatra to be placed in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, a shrine associated with his own family's claimed divine ancestor. For many Romans, this was startling. It suggested that he saw the Queen of Egypt as part of his own public story in a way that went beyond ordinary alliance. Conservative observers were already nervous about his accumulation of honors, Now they saw, in addition, a living reminder that he had links with a monarchy that had no patience for republican scruples. For Cleopatra, the Rome visit was a chance to observe the city that had become the central force in her world. She saw the crowded forum, the quarrelsome Senate, the contrast between shabby tenements and grand villas. She would also have seen how fragile everything looked beneath the marble. Street brawls, political feuds, and the exaggerated honors given to Caesar made it obvious that the Republic was not at ease with itself. When Caesar was killed, the shock rippled outward. In Alexandria, the news would have been received with a mixture of fear and urgent calculation. In Rome, Cleopatra's position became suddenly untenable. Whatever protection she had enjoyed as the partner of the dominant figure in Roman life evaporated in a shower of knife strokes on the Senate floor. She left the city and returned to Egypt, where she would soon have to navigate a new set of alliances, this time with men who claimed to inherit Caesar's mantle. For the moment, though, in this part of the story, what matters is that her meeting with Caesar had reshaped both their lives. For him, the Egyptian interlude provided money, prestige, and a reminder that there were other ancient powers in the world besides Rome. For her, the Roman connection offered a shield and a lever, and a child whose very name was a political statement. Their paths would not cross again in person, but the consequences of their partnership would echo through the next generation of Mediterranean history. By the time Caesar finished arranging matters in the eastern Mediterranean and sent Cleopatra back to her palace beside the Nile, his thoughts were turning once more toward Rome. Years in Gaul had made him the most successful commander of his generation. Years of civil tension had made him the most worrying figure in the eyes of many senators. They could count as well as anyone, and they knew how many loyal legions stood behind his name. For a while they had tried the usual Roman solution, which was to pretend that all this was entirely normal and that the constitution was as healthy as ever. Eventually they stopped pretending. The core of the problem was simple. Caesar did not want to give up his command without guarantees about his future, and a group of senators wanted him stripped of that command before he could stand for office again. In their ideal world, he would return quietly as a private citizen, at which point any number of delayed prosecutions for past actions could be brought against him. In his ideal world, he would step from provincial power into another central magistracy without passing through a vulnerable middle stage, they argued. They sent letters. None of it solved the clash between fear and ambition. In the winter of 49, before the Common Era, the standoff finally cracked. The Senate, under the influence of men who now looked to Pompey as their champion, declared that Caesar must dismiss his legions and return at once. Caesar replied that he would do so if Pompey did the same, a suggestion that was received in the capital with something less than enthusiasm. As messages flew back and forth, the window for compromise closed. Then, in one of those gestures that later ages remember with an almost theatrical clarity, Caesar walked with his troops to a little river that marked the edge of his lawful command area and crossed it. The Rubicon was not a mighty stream. It was in many ways an unremarkable piece of Italian geography. What made it important was law. No general was supposed to bring a standing army across that line into Italy without permission. Doing so was an act of rebellion. Caesar knew exactly what he was doing. Later writers give him a suitably dramatic remark about dice and fate as he stepped across. Whether he actually said it hardly matters. The decision itself spoke loudly enough. Panic and confusion followed in Rome. Pompey and the more vocal senators decided that the city was not defensible with the troops immediately at hand. Rather than risk being trapped, they withdrew south and then across the sea to Greece, planning to gather forces there. Caesar advanced through Italy at a pace that surprised many. Towns opened their gates, sometimes out of sympathy, sometimes out of sheer nervousness. He was careful to treat his fellow citizens with restraint, promising safety to those who did not resist. It was not a reign of terror, it was an increasingly confident march. He moved swiftly to Spain, where loyal forces of Pompey were stationed, and neutralized them before they could join their commander. Then he turned back east, crossed into Greece, and met Pompey's main army on open ground near a place called Pharsalus. Pompey had more soldiers and more senators in his camp. Caesar had veterans who had followed him through forests and sieges. The battle was hard and close fought, with cavalry swirling on the flanks and clouds of dust rising above the infantry lines. In the end, Caesar's men broke through, and Pompey's army dissolved into a rout. The great rival fled toward Egypt, where the welcoming party that awaited him would ensure he never troubled Caesar again. After dealing with the complicated situation in Alexandria and brushing aside a challenge in Asia so quickly that a short note to Rome announcing victory later became a proverb, Caesar returned to the central theatre of affairs. There he fought and won further battles against remaining opponents in North Africa and Spain. The details of these campaigns mattered deeply to those who lived or died in them. To the wider Roman public, the main point was that each year another cluster of enemies was swept away. By the middle 40s, before the Common Era, there was no serious armed resistance left. Caesar was in sole command of the Roman world. The Republic, being allergic in theory to kings, had an old magistracy that could be dusted off in emergencies. This was the dictatorship, a role originally designed to allow one man to act decisively for a strictly limited period during a crisis. Caesar had already held this office more than once on a temporary basis. Now the terms stretched. He was made dictator for a number of years in succession, and then finally dictator for life. The title was old. The scope it now had was new. In practice, this meant that almost every decision passed through him. He chaired the Senate, controlled legislation, and directed foreign policy. He did not abolish republican institutions. He preferred to sit at the center of them, like the eye in a storm, while the familiar forms continued to whirl around him. He enlarged the Senate by bringing in men from Italy and the provinces, reasoning that a wider pool of elites might strengthen the state and tie more people to his system. Traditionalists grumbled that the dignity of the body was diluted. New members enjoyed their sudden rise. He reformed the calendar with the help of astronomers, aligning it more closely with the solar year and creating the pattern of months and leap days that would endure in Europe for many centuries. He tinkered with debts, reduced some obligations, and stabilized the coinage. He founded colonies, sending veterans to new homes that would also anchor Roman influence in distant lands. He granted citizenship and local rights in ways that made the idea of being Roman more attractive to communities far from the Tiber. Honors rained down on him, some sought, some offered by senators who were never quite sure how much enthusiasm was expected. He received a special chair, a laurel wreath that conveniently covered his thinning hair, and the title Father of the Country. Statues of him appeared in temples. His image looked out from coins, something no living Roman had previously arranged for himself. All of this made daily business look a little like life in a monarchy, even if the word itself remained taboo. It was during a public festival that an episode occurred which made many stomachs tighten. Mark Antony, a loyal supporter who was very comfortable with crowds, offered Caesar a crown in front of an audience. Caesar refused it, perhaps sincerely, perhaps with an eye on the reaction. The crowd murmured. Some were relieved, others disappointed. The incident lodged itself in the minds of senators who already felt that the ground beneath the old constitution was becoming very soft. Among those senators were men who had once fought beside Caesar or served under him. Gaius Cassius was a sharp-minded figure with a long record of service. Marcus Brutus was the descendant of an ancestor who, at least in legend, had helped overthrow the last Roman king centuries earlier. He had been pardoned by Caesar after backing the losing side in the civil wars and had been treated with marked courtesy. To see such men slowly move from uneasy acceptance to active plotting is one of the more unsettling turns in the story. They told themselves that they were saving the Republic from monarchy. They also knew that they were risking everything. Whispers and private meetings in houses and gardens produced a plan. Caesar would attend a session of the Senate on a particular day in March, in a hall that formed part of a complex built by Pompey. The symbolism did not go unnoticed among the conspirators. They arranged to have a large group of them present, armed with daggers concealed under their clothing. Some were motivated by principle, others by resentment or jealousy, still others by fear of what might happen if no one acted. On the appointed morning, friends and family tried to dissuade Caesar from going. There were rumors of omens, intercepted notes, nervous dreams. He waved them aside, either from impatience, fatalism, or a refusal to believe that fellow senators would dare. He entered the chamber, took his seat, and began to receive petitions. What followed has been described so often that it takes effort to remember that for the people in that room it was shocking and chaotic rather than inevitable. A senator approached with a request, grabbed his toga as if to plead more closely, and then the knives came out. Blows fell from every side. Caesar tried to defend himself for a moment, then saw familiar faces among his attackers. He fell beneath a rain of strikes, his body left near the base of a statue of Pompey, the old rival whose shadow had never quite left Roman politics. Outside, the city buzzed with confusion. Some thought that liberty had been restored. Others feared that the death of one dominant figure would simply open the way to more bloodshed. Mark Antony and other supporters of Caesar moved quickly to secure the forum. The conspirators, calling themselves liberators, tried to explain their actions to a crowd that had recently enjoyed food, games, and condoned debt relief from the murdered man. In the days that followed, Rome discovered that removing a single central figure did not magically restore the delicate balance that had existed in earlier generations. Caesar's will named a young relative, Gaius Octavius, as his adopted son and principal heir. Mark Antony held the public treasury and the loyalty of many soldiers. The senatorial elite was split between fear, relief, and regret. The Republic, which had survived foreign wars and internal uprisings, now faced another round of struggles, begun by men who believed they were preserving it